Right now, someone is reading you. They're calculating your next move before you make it. They're engineering your decisions while you think you're in control. And the most dangerous part? You have no idea it's happening. Welcome to the invisible war of influence that's being waged in boardrooms, dating apps, political campaigns, and even your family dinner table. America has become obsessed with dark psychology, not because we're evil, but because we finally realized the game was already being played against us. Every day, you encounter manipulators who've studied Machiavelli, Cialdini, and ancient persuasion tactics that hijack your brain's wiring. They know your cognitive biases better than you do. They exploit your need for consistency, your fear of missing out, your tribal instincts. And while you're worrying about being a good person, they're 3 steps ahead, pulling strings you can't even see. The brutal truth is this: ignorance isn't bliss anymore. It's vulnerability. The question isn't whether you'll learn these tactics. The question is whether you'll learn them before someone uses them to dismantle everything you've built. This isn't about becoming a monster. It's about seeing the monsters clearly. So let me ask you something. Are you ready to pull back the curtain? You've probably noticed something shifting in America over the last decade. There's a new kind of literacy emerging, not in books or mathematics, but in human manipulation. Walk into any bookstore and you'll find entire sections dedicated to influence, persuasion, and what's euphemistically called social dynamics. Podcasts dissect narcissistic behavior patterns. YouTube channels break down frame control and psychological warfare. Everyone suddenly wants to understand the dark side of human nature, and there's a reason for that. We're living through the greatest age of manipulation in human history. Social media algorithms exploit dopamine pathways like slot machines. Politicians use focus-grouped language designed by behavioral psychologists. Corporations employ teams of people whose entire job is making you buy things you don't need. Dating has become a strategic battlefield where ghosting, breadcrumbing, and love bombing are standard tactics. The workplace is a theater of power plays that would make Machiavelli proud. We didn't choose this reality, but we're forced to navigate it. And here's what most people miss. The ones winning aren't necessarily smarter or more talented. They're simply more aware of the game being played. They understand that every human interaction contains hidden layers of influence, and they've learned to operate on those layers consciously, while everyone else stumbles through life on autopilot. This video will give you something most people will never have: a map of the invisible battlefield. You need to understand something fundamental about power before we go any further. Power doesn't corrupt, absolutely. That's a comforting lie we tell ourselves. What actually happens is that power reveals. It reveals who is always willing to exploit others, but lacked the means. It reveals who has principles strong enough to withstand temptation. And most importantly, it reveals the hidden hierarchies and manipulation tactics that structure every human group. Machiavelli understood this 500 years ago when he wrote The Prince. He wasn't teaching people to be evil. He was describing reality as it actually exists, stripped of the moral fairy tales we prefer to believe. He observed that the leaders who survive aren't the most virtuous, they're the most strategically flexible. They understand when to be generous and when to be ruthless, when to keep promises and when to break them, when to appear weak and when to display strength. The American obsession with these dark psychology tactics isn't happening in a vacuum. We're watching our institutions crumble. Trust in media, government, religion, and even science has collapsed. When the old authorities fail, people stop looking for external guidance and start learning the raw mechanics of influence themselves. They want to understand how power actually works, not how we wish it worked. And what they're discovering is uncomfortable. The most successful people aren't always playing by the rules everyone else follows. They're playing a different game entirely, one with hidden rules that no one explicitly teaches. The uncomfortable question is this: if you refuse to learn these rules, are you being virtuous or just naive? Because I guarantee the person trying to manipulate you hasn't handicapped themselves with that moral dilemma. Let me tell you about a tactic that's currently running rampant in corporate America: strategic incompetence. You've probably experienced this without recognizing it. Someone at work consistently fails at tasks they don't want to do, not because they can't do them, but because they've calculated that being perceived as incompetent in specific areas will get them reassigned to better work. It's brilliant in its simplicity. Most people assume incompetence is accidental, so they never see the manipulation. The person deploying this tactic faces no social penalty because incompetence generates pity, not suspicion. Meanwhile, they've successfully shaped their role without ever having to negotiate directly or reveal their preferences. This works because of a principle Machiavelli understood deeply: appearances matter more than reality. It's not about what you are. It's about what people believe you are. And people will believe almost anything if you're patient enough to construct the right narrative. The modern workplace is filled with these invisible tactics. There's the meeting manipulator who always speaks last, letting others commit to positions before revealing their own calculated stance. There's the credit thief who contributes just enough to meetings to later claim ownership of successful projects. There's the strategic befriender who builds alliances not through genuine connection, but through carefully distributed favors that create obligation. These people aren't necessarily sociopaths. Many of them are just playing the game one level deeper than everyone else. They've recognized that success often comes not from working harder, but from working the system. And here's the part that should worry you: these tactics work. The person using strategic incompetence often does get better assignments. The meeting manipulator frequently wins debates. The credit thief advances faster than the person who actually did the work. If you're still playing the naive game of just work hard and be honest, you're bringing a knife to a gunfight. But there's something even more insidious happening beneath these individual tactics. Something that explains why America has become so obsessed with dark psychology. We're living through the collapse of what social scientists call high-trust societies. For most of America's history, you could generally assume people meant what they said. Handshake deals meant something. Your word was your bond. That social fabric is disintegrating, and it's being replaced by what I call verification culture. Nobody trusts anything anymore without proof. And that shift has massive psychological implications. When you can't trust the baseline honesty of interactions, you start looking for hidden agendas everywhere. You begin analyzing every conversation for manipulation tactics. You question motives constantly. This isn't paranoia, it's adaptation. And it's exhausting. But it's also necessary, because the manipulators haven't disappeared just because we've become more suspicious. They've simply evolved. Modern manipulation has become more sophisticated precisely because people are more aware of it. The tactics that worked 20 years ago are now obvious. So manipulators have developed meta-strategies, techniques designed to work even on people who think they're too smart to be manipulated. One of the most powerful is called voluntary compliance engineering. Instead of forcing you to do something, the manipulator creates conditions where you believe you're choosing freely while actually following a script they designed. Marketing companies have perfected this. They don't tell you to buy their product. They create an identity you want to embody, then position their product as essential to that identity. You're not being sold anything. You're expressing yourself. Except the self you're expressing was engineered by a team of psychologists working for a corporation. Political campaigns use the same playbook. They don't convince you to support their candidate. They identify your existing fears and values, then present their candidate as the perfect solution to threats you didn't know existed until they mention them. You feel like you've done your research and made an informed choice. But the entire information environment you made that choice within was carefully constructed. Here's where it gets really dark. Once you understand these tactics exist, you face an impossible choice. Option 1. Remain ignorant and vulnerable. Option 2. Learn the tactics and risk becoming the thing you hate. Most people choose a third option. They learn just enough to recognize manipulation, but not enough to defend against it effectively. This is actually the worst position, because now you're paranoid, but still vulnerable. You see manipulation everywhere, even where it doesn't exist, destroying relationships and opportunities through suspicion. But you still fall for sophisticated tactics because your knowledge is superficial. The people who truly master dark psychology don't just learn the tactics. They understand the underlying principles that make all manipulation possible. And those principles are simpler than you think. Every manipulation tactic exploits one of three vulnerabilities: your need to be consistent with past behavior, your desire to be liked and accepted by your group, or your fear of scarcity and missing out. That's it. Every elaborate scheme ultimately reduces to one of these three psychological pressure points. The compliance tactic, called foot in the door, works by getting you to agree to something small first, then leveraging your need for consistency to get you to agree to something larger. You already said yes once, so saying no now would mean admitting your initial judgment was wrong. Most people can't handle that cognitive dissonance, so they escalate their commitment. The tactic, called social proof, works by showing you that people similar to you have already made a choice, triggering your tribal instinct to conform. You don't want to be the outsider who missed something obvious. The tactic of artificial scarcity works by suggesting an opportunity is about to disappear, triggering your loss aversion, which is psychologically stronger than your desire for gain. You'll take actions to avoid losing something that you'd never take just to acquire it. Once you see these patterns, you can't unsee them. They're everywhere. And that brings us to the real reason America is obsessed with dark psychology right now. We're not just learning these tactics defensively. We're learning them because we've realized that everyone else is already using them. It's an arms race. Your dating competition has read The Game and understands pickup artist psychology. Your business competitors have studied Robert Greene's 48 Laws of Power. Your political opponents employ behavioral scientists. If you handicap yourself with ignorance, you're not being noble. You're being stupid. But here's the trap. As more people learn these tactics, they become less effective in their crude forms. So practitioners develop increasingly sophisticated versions. What started as simple psychological tricks has evolved into elaborate strategic frameworks. Modern manipulators don't just use one tactic. They layer multiple techniques, creating redundancy, so that even if you catch one manipulation attempt, two others are still working on you. They'll combine artificial scarcity with social proof and consistency pressure in a single interaction. You might resist the scarcity play because you've learned about that tactic. But while you're feeling smart about catching it, the social proof element is still influencing you beneath your conscious awareness. This is why surface-level knowledge of dark psychology is dangerous. It gives you false confidence. You think you're protected because you can name some tactics. But naming something doesn't make you immune to it. Doctors get sick despite understanding medicine. Psychologists struggle with their own biases despite studying them professionally. And people who study manipulation still get manipulated by experts. The difference is that experts understand the metagame. They're not just deploying tactics. They're managing your perception of whether tactics are even being used. The best manipulators make you feel like you're the one in control, like every choice you make is authentically yours. They've learned something crucial. The moment you realize you're being manipulated, the manipulation loses much of its power. So the goal is never letting you realize it. Let me give you a concrete example of how this works in high-stakes environments. Venture capital negotiations are a masterclass in layered manipulation. The entrepreneur thinks they're pitching their company, but experienced VCs are running multiple psychological operations simultaneously. They'll use what's called strategic ambiguity, where their level of interest is deliberately unclear. This creates anxiety in the entrepreneur, making them more likely to accept worse terms just to achieve certainty. They'll employ consensus manipulation, where multiple partners at the firm say slightly different things, forcing the entrepreneur to try reconciling contradictory signals. While the entrepreneur is confused and off balance, they're more suggestible. They'll use time pressure tactics combined with artificial social proof by mentioning other companies they're looking at or other investors circling the deal. This triggers both scarcity anxiety and fear of being the person who missed an obvious opportunity. And here's the elegant part. The entrepreneur has probably read about negotiation tactics. They know they should hold firm on valuation. They know they shouldn't make decisions based on fear. But knowledge isn't immunity. The VC has done this hundreds of times. The entrepreneur has done it once or twice. The experience gap is insurmountable without equivalent training. This dynamic plays out everywhere. The experienced manipulator will always defeat the knowledgeable amateur, because manipulation isn't about information, it's about emotional control. And emotional control comes from practice, not books. You can read every psychology text ever written and still get played by someone with street-level experience in reading and managing human behavior. So, what's the answer? How do you actually defend yourself in this environment? The uncomfortable truth is that you can't defend yourself through knowledge alone. You need something else, something most people don't want to hear. You need to become comfortable with conflict. That's the real secret that separates people who get manipulated from people who don't. Most manipulation works because people will do almost anything to avoid confrontation. They'll agree to things they don't want. They'll ignore their own boundaries. They'll override their intuition. All because the alternative is saying no directly and dealing with the social discomfort that creates. Manipulators know this and exploit it ruthlessly. They structure interactions so that resistance requires confrontation, while compliance is the path of least resistance. The salesman who keeps talking after you've said no, gradually wearing down your resistance. The romantic partner who pouts when you set boundaries, training you that having needs creates conflict. The boss who frames unreasonable requests as team loyalty tests, making refusal feel like betrayal. These tactics work because most people are conflict averse. We're taught from childhood that being agreeable is virtuous, that saying no is selfish, that creating tension is bad. This socialization creates a massive vulnerability that sophisticated manipulators exploit. But here's what changes everything. Manipulators are also conflict averse, just in a different way. They avoid direct confrontation by using manipulation. If you force interactions into explicit honesty, most manipulators will back down because their tactics only work in ambiguity. When you say clearly, "I notice you're using social proof tactics to pressure my decision. Let's discuss the actual merits instead," you've destroyed their operational environment. They can't openly admit they were manipulating you without losing all credibility. So they're forced to either engage honestly or exit the interaction. This is why the most manipulation-resistant people aren't necessarily the ones with the most psychological knowledge. They're the ones most comfortable with directness and conflict. They'll simply name what's happening out loud, forcing everything into explicit clarity. Manipulators hate operating in clear light. Their power dissolves when you refuse to pretend. So here's your real choice, the one nobody wants to talk about honestly. You can learn dark psychology tactics for defense, understanding them well enough to recognize and counter them. That's the conventional advice, and it has value. But there's a deeper option most people never consider. You can learn these tactics not just for defense, but for offense. You can become someone who uses them strategically when necessary. And before you recoil in horror, let me ask you something. If you're negotiating your salary, and you know the hiring manager is using anchoring tactics to lowball you, is it wrong to use counter tactics? If you're dealing with a genuinely manipulative person who's harming others, Is it wrong to use their own tactics against them to neutralize their influence? If you're in a competitive environment where everyone else is playing the full game, is it wrong to match their level? The Machiavellian answer is that morality is contextual. The tactics themselves are neutral tools. What matters is the outcome you're pursuing and the alternatives available. Sometimes manipulation is the least harmful option. Sometimes refusing to use these tactics means accepting worse outcomes for yourself and people you care about. The purest position that you should never manipulate anyone ever sounds noble until you realize that position itself is often a manipulation tactic used by people who are already in power to prevent you from challenging them effectively. They want you bound by rules they don't follow themselves. This is the real protocol Machiavelli was describing. Not a system for being evil, but a framework for navigating a world where others aren't constrained by your moral limitations. The question isn't whether you'll engage with dark psychology. You're already engaged, whether you want to be or not. The question is whether you'll engage consciously and competently, or whether you'll stumble through life as someone else's pawn, feeling virtuous while losing every game that matters. That's the choice America is making right now, one person at a time. And the most interesting part? The very fact that you watched this far means you've already made your choice. You're not here for moral philosophy. You're here because you recognize the game being played and you want to understand the rules. Welcome to the protocol. Now the real question is, what will you do with what you know? If you're ready to take these strategies beyond theory, check the pinned comment. The link I left there is the next step to becoming truly untouchable.